Thank you all for all of the attendees and all of our panelists. This discussion is titled I Can't Breathe. The subject matter is chokehold bans, duty to intervene policies, and other reforms to help keep detainees alive. My name is Andre Gibson. I'm with Mayor Harris's office here at Shelby County Government. I am very excited to be the moderator for this topic. I think it's a very timely discussion given all the discussion in our local governments around the country about police reform and police tactics reform. This is very timely for us to have this conversation here today. I want to give each one of our panelists just a brief second to introduce themselves and their proximity to this topic. We've got a really star-studded panel today. I'm going to start with you, Attorney Working.
My name is Mike Working. I'm the president of the Tennessee Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. I have a practice in Memphis for about 15 years. I'm also someone who was formerly wrongfully accused, not convicted, but that certainly sparked my journey on a quest for more justice in this country. But I defend cases all the way down from very low-level misdemeanors to capital defense, which is my passion. You know, trying to make Memphis a little more just every day.
All right, and we're going to go to Councilman Smiley. No, did we lose Councilman Smiley? We lost Councilman Smiley. Okay, I'm going to try my best. Sinyangwe.
Close. My name is Sam Sinyangwe. I'm a co-founder of Campaign Zero, and over the past 5 years, we have been collecting data, reviewing policies and practices of police departments across the country, including use of force policies, police union contracts, and other documents that articulate what police officers are allowed to do and what they cannot do, and review data on the 100 largest cities across the country to better understand the role that policies like some of the policies you mentioned, banning chokeholds or requiring officers to intervene when they see another officer committing misconduct, the role that those policies can play in potentially preventing police violence or making it possible to hold officers accountable to engaging in some of these acts that we've seen across the country. So happy to be here and to take a deeper dive into some of these issues.
Very happy to have you. Councilman Smiley, were you able to rejoin us? I see you're listed, but you're muted and your camera's off. Give him a second to get his feed together, but we're going to go ahead and launch into the questions and give Councilman Smiley an opportunity to introduce himself a little bit later. I am going to start with a general question from both of you, and that's given the prominence of recent events that it's surprising to find out that chokehold and stranglehold bans are not widely incorporated among the country's 100 largest police forces. I wondered your thoughts on why that is, and how do police departments and unions counter a prohibition on tactics like these? What are the arguments that they make to resist making those types of reforms?
So it's a great question. And just to sort of level set around this issue, we've looked at the use of force policies for the 100 largest cities in the country and examined the extent to which they have things like banning chokeholds or strangleholds. And just for clarification, a chokehold is when the officer restricts your breathing on your trachea. A stranglehold is when they sort of put you in what they call a sleeper hold or a carotid restraint, which restricts the blood flow to your brain. Both tactics are incredibly dangerous. Both have killed people. And sadly, when we look through these policies for the 100 largest cities, only 28 of those 100 largest cities banned both chokeholds and strangleholds as a matter of policy. And what is clear is that these are common sense policies that can restrict the use of some of the most dangerous tactics in policing. And yet police departments across the country, including in Memphis, have not yet adopted those types of common sense restrictions on the use of force. And so, there's not a good argument that's really been proposed in opposition to adopting these types of policies. The general argument is that we hear from police unions and some other police groups is an argument around officer safety, that officers need to be able to use all the tools at their disposal in particular situations to defend themselves or others. There's no data, there's no research establishing that departments that have more restrictive policies are departments where officers are more likely to be in danger. In fact, the opposite is true, that departments that have the most restrictive policies are actually those departments where officers are the safest as well, because they're being required to create time and distance and space between themselves and the person they're encountering, to use de-escalation instead of jumping in and using force, and not to escalate that force to a degree which there might be some level of resistance or retaliation. So again, these are policies that keep officers safe and keep the public safer. And there's not a good argument that we've heard as to why police should be able to choke people. And even the police unions tend not to put forward an argument specific to that policy, and instead try to speak in these generalities around officer safety that themselves aren't backed by facts. Thank you.
Attorney Working or Councilman Smiley, you want to?
How about we let Councilman Smiley introduce himself, since he got bumped off, and then I'll follow up on what Sam said.
Yeah, give us a brief introduction of yourself, Councilman Smiley. And the question on the table is regarding the lack of
bans regarding chokeholds.
Exactly.
Okay, so good morning, Councilman J.B. Smiley, Memphis, Tennessee. I was recently elected on October 3rd of 2019, and the gist of, I guess, my campaign is doing something different, pushing back against the status quo and making sure that we have policies that truly work for everyday people. And, you know, just to chime in on the, I guess, the topic as it relates to the lack of bans for chokeholds. And I was just thinking about, you know, when we were talking about a juvenile detention center, we have several in Memphis, Tennessee. The individuals who work in those facilities are not allowed to choke or implement any type of tactics related to young people. And oftentimes these young people are larger than the individuals who are in charge of, you know, keeping the facility safe. What they do is they implement or they use techniques in which they're restraining an individual who is hostile, but do not directly put any force around their neck or anything like that. And I think when we talk about, you know, police or any type of law enforcement officer, I think the problem that we get into is the idea that they are at war with the people that they're sworn to protect. I think we implement policies or implement use of force strategies. The very last thing we should do is be using any type of, not necessarily the very last thing, it should be a complete ban against any type of force that could potentially take the life of someone else.
Well, yeah, there's no question there should be a ban on this type of force, and look no further than the most dangerous legal activity in America, which would be competing as a professional cage fighter in the MMA. If you were to put a chokehold on someone, there is a referee whose job is right there to stop the fight within about 10 to 15 seconds if a chokehold is enacted on one of the combatants. The fact that this can be legally done to anyone who is not a professional fighter, who knows how to evade it, is a form of lethal force. It is lethal force is much more than just what is occurring when an officer draws his service weapon to shoot someone. This is a way of actually killing someone, as we've all seen with Mr. Floyd in person. And one of the real problems that this is even being a discussion. I mean, in a civilized society, police do not execute people or use techniques to subdue them that are lethal before they've been charged, before they've been arraigned, before they've been actually formally accused of a crime. This is judge, jury, and executioner. One of the problems in our country is very consistently for the last 50 years, anytime that there is an effort to reform anything related to criminal justice, as a defense attorney, defense attorneys are completely excluded from the process. There has not been a sentencing task force or a criminal justice reform task force in Tennessee that had ever more than about one defense attorney on it in the last 50 years. Which is kind of like having, I mean, like the Memphis Crime Commission, which is a perfect example. There are 60 people on it. many former prosecutors who are now judges, many former prosecutors who are now corporate lawyers, many current prosecutors. It's kind of, and there's 60 people and there's no defense attorney. Not even one, not even like Phyllis Aluko, who was just on the last panel, who's the chief public defender. Nobody. So when you exclude the people whose job it is to go into a courtroom and check police, it's a very simple concept. The 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment of the United States Constitution are basically all saying we do not break the law to enforce the law. And when you exclude the people who do that for a living, it's preposterous. We never get a reform. We never get a change for improvement. We get more of the same. And you'll see that with the Memphis Crime Commission. They're all calling for more sentences, longer sentences, tougher sentences. I mean, we're already sending children to prison for life. And if you continue to exclude defense attorneys, you're going to get the same results. Police wanting more power, prosecutors wanting more power, and that's what we keep getting. And it's why the debate is so out of whack and skewed that we're legitimately sitting here as educated men having a debate about whether police should choke people to death or choke them out as a form of subduing them. So it's just, again, it's how out of whack it is. And it's not that we just have to get defense attorneys included. There's been one task force that had a defense attorney on parole reform. It's kind of like having a racial justice forum or like improving racial relations with 60 white people as the task force. I mean, until you get like 30 defense attorneys out of 60, you're never going to have any kind of serious debate about how systemic it is for our clients at every level to never get a foot up in the system and never get equal treatment or even fair treatment.
Excellent response. Thank you. Thank you. Next question. Actually, going to point a question at each one of you individually. I'll ask them all up front and let you guys kind of go in order. For Sam, my question is, what advice would you give Councilman Smiley as an elected official on how to push forward on these types of systematic reforms in the face of possible backlash from the law enforcement community?
Yeah, so
I'm going to get them all out. For Councilman Smiley.
Answer to this, but there are a couple of things that have been helpful. You know, we've done advocacy in cities and also at the state level for the past 5 years. And one of the things that we've learned is just the power of data as a tool for bringing folks on board who otherwise may not be willing to come to the table. And especially trying to dispel some of the myths and the narratives that have prevented change from happening up to this point. And so there are a set of myths or narratives that you hear around the issue, any type of change or reform to policing. There are a common set of arguments that are used to try to kill those proposals. And the arguments tend to revolve around either that this change will somehow endanger officers, or this change will somehow endanger the public or lead to crime rates increasing. Those are sort of the two narratives that you hear. But you'll notice that there's very little of any data to establish either of those narratives being true. These are sort of, these are narratives that have been around for a long time, that have a power because they are so widely used and widely recognized, sort of in the way that when we talk about guns and gun safety, there's a set of narratives about, if we just had more guns, more people would be safer, where, you look at the data, it's not really clear that that's the case. In fact, it's actually probably the opposite, but that narrative has a lot of power and it's used to actually block legislation time and time again. In policing, it's no different. And so part of it is being prepared with the data, with the examples to help you move past some of those arguments and get into a solutions conversation. Because those arguments essentially block you from getting into a conversation about solutions because they try to deny that there's a problem or to deny that any of these solutions would actually help people's lives. And so a couple of things. On the argument about officer safety, I mentioned that there's no data establishing that more restrictive policies on law enforcement cause officers to be in more danger. There's just no data establishing that. If anything, officers are safer in the jurisdictions that have more restrictive policies. On the crime piece of this, there is an argument that if you were to restrict officers from using force in particular situations, if you were to cut the police budget or the scope of things that police are responding to, that it would leave folks in communities who are calling for help without the help that they need to keep them safe. That's sort of the narrative of the argument. But when we look at the police budget, when we look at what police are actually responding to, what is clear is that the vast majority of things that they are actually involved in doing today are not things that have a clear public safety rationale. So instead, what we see, and this was data that was reported in the New York Times a few weeks ago, they looked at what do police actually spend their time doing on a typical shift. And they found that only about 4% of the time that they spend on a typical shift is focusing on addressing issues of violent crime. Only about 4%. An even smaller proportion of overall calls, 911 calls that police receive, focuses on violent crime as well. So it's between 1% and 2% of all 911 calls involved of violent crime. So even when you look at arrest data, which is a more extreme sort of sample of police engagements, these are like the engagements that are already at a level where police feel like they're taking an enforcement action, where people's liberty is being compromised, where people are getting a record. And even in those situations, only about 5% of all arrests that are made nationwide, according to the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, are for violent crime. And only about 12% of arrests are for property crime. So the vast majority of arrests, the vast majority of 911 calls, the vast majority of what officers spend their time doing are not responding to violent crimes. It's responding to things like mental health crises, responding to things like substance use and substance abuse, drug possession, responding to things like folks who are calling for, who might have a car accident and they need somebody on the scene, folks who are in situations that you do not need somebody armed with a gun to respond to in the first place. And so what's really important here is being able to level set with policymakers, with police, that the things that you are concerned about with regard to public safety, we also share that concern. And what we also know is the vast majority of the things that you're being called to do, you're frankly not the experts in doing. You're not an expert in how to interact with folks with mental health issues. You're not an expert in how to address issues of poverty and homelessness. And we should be having the experts respond to things that they're the experts in, and leave the police to respond to the things that the police need to respond to. And that those are completely different things. And we need to shift the resources and shift the responsibilities from police into an alternative response, and empowering those experts to be the responders to those situations. So big picture, I think there's a compelling argument to make using the data that if you're interested in public safety, if you're interested in crime prevention, we too share that concern, and that would involve shifting resources into the most effective responses to a set of issues that are not really about public safety, but are more so about poverty, about inequality, about issues with housing affordability, about issues with mental health, about issues that we should be empowering the experts on those issues to actually respond to more effectively than any police officer could. So I think big picture, that's the type of, when you can get that data, when you can go through the calls for service data, and you can present that in a way that shows that we're not compromising police safety, we're not compromising public safety. What we're saying is that there are a set of policies that can protect people from police violence, that don't endanger officers, and there are a set of broader priorities and reimagining of public safety that needs to happen if we want to protect communities from crime more broadly, both of which require us to take action on some of these reform measures that have been proposed, both in terms of cutting the police budget and in terms of changing police policies that can limit the amount of force that they can use.
All right. That's an excellent response. Councilman Smiley, I'm going to point a similar question your way. Just to let you guys know, we're getting a lot of excellent questions in the Q&A. We'll be queuing up for questions and answers from the audience in the last 15 minutes of the session.
Okay.
Councilman Smiley, what are the practical realities of trying to negotiate reform of police activities as a city councilman? And when you make an argument that's pro-police reform, what's the other side of the argument that you hear?
I wish you all would have jumped. First of all, I'm in the amen choir for Sam here today. Some of those same points I've echoed in multiple council meetings when we start dealing with police reform. But usually when you talk about, police reform as an elected official, I have colleagues who are anti any type of budget cut as it relates to police, anti any type of reform as it relates to police, because they are the opinion and mindset that more officers equal less crime. And I take a completely different position. But so for us on the city council, you need 7 votes. And the goal is, how do you convince your colleagues who have been trained to believe that more officers equals less crime? And I think a lot of times it comes down to which side of the railroad tracks you grew up on. If you're a member of my community, the Black community, the way your perception of police is not a friendly perception. When you see police officers, you do not see Mr. Friendly. You see someone who's coming to take away or do harm to the people that you grew up with. Now, if you grew up on a different side of tracks, a more wealthier side of tracks, in a white community, you see police officers as those individuals who are going to try to protect and serve you. So I think when you talk about that, you have to find ways to make everyone come to the point of a consensus. This is what is best for our community going forward. And a lot of times you're not going to make everyone happy. The argument from the police, and I told Sam, I was in Sam's Amen choir, it's always officer safety. You're going to endanger our officers. What I would suggest is something that Sam said earlier, is we're putting our police in situations that they're not equipped to handle. We have to bring in other entities, other professions that are more equipped to handle certain calls. And in reality, when you talk about handling certain calls, we have to bring in our guidance. We have to bring in social workers. We have to bring in mental health therapists. We have to bring in professionals who have years of training to deal with some of the issues that are going on in the community, whether it's financial literacy, whether it's how to de-escalate a situation properly, someone having a mental health episode. We have to bring in the experts to address those problems. But my the biggest pushback I get when I talk about any type of police reform is from some of our older, more seasoned members of our community, because they have the mindset, and I think Sam talked about it as well, that it's a narrative that's been going on for years and years at a time, that they want to feel safe, and the only way to feel safe is having more officers. And we just have to find ways to dispel that myth, dispel that narrative. And once we're able to do that, we can have the type of long-lasting and systemic change in our communities, so that we can have equal treatment under the law.
Thank you. Great response. Mike, I'll give you a chance to also touch on this topic.
One of the things, I can speak, from defending criminal cases in Memphis for 15 years. You do get to know a lot of the officers. You do get to know the way things work. And even just for simple logistical stuff like when to subpoena someone or how. Generally, there's been one way of doing things in almost all police precincts, and that is you get assigned as an officer to one precinct. It may be a high crime neighborhood. You're going to be there for 2 or 3 years. And then you maybe get a desk job in another precinct, and it's not as dangerous. And then you get to become a detective, and you sort of work in a central location. Well, for police psychology, there's no reason. I mean, Memphis, we have a crime problem. We're one of the most violent places in America. There's no reason that an officer, out of 2,300 officers or 2,000 officers that we have, there's no reason to send the same 100 guys into a dangerous neighborhood all the time. There's no reason that they can't do, like in the military, when you're deployed in other countries, you may do a week in the war zone, and then you do a week in a wealthy neighborhood that doesn't have much need for patrol. And you could be in the precinct doing things like, in service on de-escalation techniques. There's no reason that it has to be, this is your assignment, where you're occupying force that's at war with the people for a 2 or 3 year tour of duty. It can be that you are a policeman to this city, and 1 week you're on the south side, and 1 week you're on the east side, and in the next 6 months you're on the north side and the west side. It doesn't have to be that you're just this occupying force doing the same repetitive job. One of the problems we have in the criminal justice system, especially with prosecutors, but also with police, is that no one takes ownership of a case. There's an assembly line of justice where maybe it's a close call, I'll let the next guy decide. I'll just, do the arrest and pass it on. And the prosecutor goes, well, maybe I should drop this, but I don't want to get in trouble. I'll pass it on to the next courtroom. I'll pass it up the chain. I'll pass it. And it'll be I'll work a case. I'll have 11 prosecutors that I deal with before I get to somebody who has authority to make a real decision. And it works the same way with police. Just arrest this guy, pass the buck. Some other sergeant will determine this or whatever. And it doesn't have to be where they get beaten down by their own patrol duties and things. It can be where, you know, people want to be going to work rather than, oh, I have to go into the war zone again.
Right. Interesting. I'm going to touch back on something Sam said in the previous response, and you mentioned the use of data as a verifying point for some of these policies and tactics. I wanted to expand on that by asking you, how can data be used to measure the effectiveness of these policies and procedures for law enforcement once they're adopted? And what are the things that what are other things that we would measure to show whether these reforms are having success?
Great question. And this is a huge issue in the broader sort of research community because it's really, really hard to evaluate the effectiveness of a particular policy in a police department. For a variety of reasons. I think first and foremost, this is not a randomized control trial, right? You can't just conduct an experiment where half the department has one policy and the other half the department has another policy, and you're seeing, you know, what was the difference between that. So it's tough, but with the data that we do have, there are a couple of things that we've learned about what works and what doesn't work. And, you know, I think first and foremost, it's important to understand that many of the most popular reforms to policing do not have a strong evidence of effectiveness in reducing police use of force or reducing the racial disparities in policing. Two of the biggest issues that we're talking about. One of those things is body cameras, which a whole lot of money has been spent on body cameras. A whole lot of departments have adopted them. What we've learned now, and this they have been able to do randomized control trials on because they can outfit some of the officers with body cameras, some of them without it. The study on body cameras that's been conducted to date has been focused on DC Police Department with thousands of officers, randomly assigning some officers to the body cameras, some of them not. And what they found was the body cameras did not make it less likely for officers to use force. It did not change the likelihood that an officer would commit misconduct. What it did do was, and what we've seen in other studies as well, is that body cameras can make it more likely for officers to be held accountable because there's video evidence. And video evidence is often a requirement to be able to hold any officers accountable, just given the system and how difficult it is in the first place to hold police accountable. So on the accountability side, they can make a difference, but they don't prevent the incident from happening in the first place, which I think is the ideal solution. So that's body cameras. The other big thing that has been a topic of conversation is about community policing. This idea, and I think, you know, Michael, you touched on this idea that we should be having officers that sort of flood communities, particularly Black communities, with officers on every corner, the same officers assigned to the same blocks or patrols over time, and that by just simply saturating communities with a lot of officers who get to know people, who have conversations and coffee with a cop, and all of these, you know, play football with your kids, that somehow is going to address some of the broader systemic issues in policing. And there's no data to support that either. I think what we've seen in the research is that community policing might change levels of trust between communities and law enforcement. It might change attitudes of officers and community members, but it doesn't change the use of force rates. It doesn't change the racial disparities. It doesn't change the core things that need to change. And so those are some things that don't work very well. Training is sort of a third one of these areas where we don't really know what works or doesn't work because there are a variety of different types of trainings, a variety of different levels of rigor applied to it, and a variety of different ways of processing, you know, after a training, whether officers are actually held accountable to doing what they learned in the training. So there's very little research to say this is an effective training, this is not an effective training, this is the type of training that should be happening instead. So all of that is what we don't know. What we do know is that there are a set of things that matter a great deal. They involve use of force policies. So the standards in place in a police department matter, just like any sector, just like in education, the standards matter. In policing, the standards matter. And if you have standards that ban things like chokeholds and strangleholds, and you know, require officers to use de-escalation, that have very clear limits on what police can or can't do, that matters. and can reduce use of force, or at least the police departments that have those policies have lower rates of use of force than those that don't. Similarly, the accountability structure matters. The police union contract and the rules that shape what happens when an officer is accused of misconduct, what levels of protections does that officer get under the union contract or under existing civil service rules and department policies and community oversight policies? Can that officer's record of misconduct just be systematically erased or purged at the officer's request, which happens in many cities across the country? Can the officer, after the officer is involved in the shooting, do they get a period of time, 48 hours, ranging all the way up to 30 days in some places, before they can even be questioned about it? When they are disciplined or fired, can the officer appeal that and get reinstated? So those are some of the core questions that are about accountability, about what happens in these incidents. Is there any real enforcement of the standards, so that if officers violate those standards that you put in place, are they actually being held accountable for it? And even if you have a police chief or a mayor that wants to hold them accountable, if you have a system that allows those officers just to get reinstated, even if they do get fired, then it's very difficult to actually make sure that those standards are enforced. So those are two things that matter a lot. And the third thing is the scope of what the police are responding to in the first place. So as a preventative strategy, saying, well, 1 in every 5 911 calls nationwide is a mental health crisis. And if we just send somebody else to the scene, like they do in some cities, like in Eugene, Oregon, that they're starting to do in Portland, you send an unarmed mental health provider who's trained to respond to those types of incidents, you've reduced the scope of policing and prevented that 1 in 5 incidents from potentially escalating to deadly force in the first place. So those are 3 broad areas where we can really make change with this strong research evidence of effectiveness, and it makes sense to focus on some of the areas that we know can make a difference right now.
Probably over time, but so I could add also, we could be more selective about who gets to be a police officer. I had to study for 7 years to become a lawyer and pass a 3-day test. You know, law enforcement goes to academy for 7 weeks. Not all of that is spent on what the law actually is. A lot of that is spent on policing techniques, but we definitely want more police officers on the street. We could be a lot more exclusive about who gets the privilege of literally having a license to kill in a $100,000 car gifted to them after a 7-week class.
Councilman Smiley, you want to touch on that one?
I just want to briefly touch on the fact that I'm not sure if we need any more officers on the street. We have about 2,100 Memphis police officers on the street now. I would suggest to you that that number is sufficient to do everything we need to do in the city. We spend millions of dollars to guard a statue, millions of dollars following individuals speaking about their rights in times of civil unrest. What I will say is that we should be allocating dollars to support communities that are in dire need of it.
All right. Moving on to the last question I have before we get into the audience Q&A. I just ask each of you, I'll go down the line. What is the role of the citizen in pursuing police reform and accountability for police violence? And what can everyday citizens who are concerned about these issues practically do to help bring about reform? And I'll start with you, Councilman Smiley.
Oh man, I love that. So what I encourage, you know, the everyday citizen to do for me is let me know. Send emails, sign petitions, come, you know, occupy City Hall one day. But, you know, whatever you do, remain active and let your voice be heard, because there's members of these elected bodies that truly are here to hear from you, truly here to ultimately bend to the will of the people. And, you know, when I think about creating reform or moving the needle in the right direction, I tell people this: I can't do it alone. I need you actively at the table. I have one organization that essentially reached out to me and said, we have this proposed ordinance, take a look at it. Let's talk about the feasibility of it. And you work hand in hand with me on this process to move things forward. And I guarantee you, we will have progress.
All right, Sam?
Yeah, so just like has been said, I think it's really important for communities, for sort of everyday people to be putting the maximum amount of pressure on elected officials, particularly at the local level, your city council members, your mayor, because so much of policing is determined by local governments. You know, it's not, you know, despite some of the action that is happening at the federal level and in Congress, they don't have a whole lot of power to shape policing practices locally. And even at the state level, there are some changes that need to happen at the state level with regard to making it possible to have real community oversight and other things that need to happen. But this is predominantly a local fight. And so putting that pressure on your city council members, sharing that data with them, doing that analysis, calling in folks who can help support. I'd be happy to support anybody to help review the data for Memphis, to review the data for other cities, and have those talking points to walk into those meetings so that you can push back against some of these narratives that have blocked progress from happening. So you can share some of the data that, oftentimes even city council members haven't seen the data for their city and how those 911 calls break down, for example, or how the budget breaks down, or how their use of force policy or police union contract compares to other cities. This is new for a lot of people. It's sad, it shouldn't have been, but it is. And particularly for city council members and other elected officials, that I think there are a lot of elected officials right now who have not quite put in the focus or the time to understand this issue more broadly. In part because I think up to this point, there has been a lot of focus on convincing the country that this is a real problem that needs to be paid attention to, that we have to do something. And I think we've sort of won that battle by and large. I think in general, there is a sense that something needs to happen, even for folks who previously opposed any type of action. I think now, even if you look at the police unions and the police chiefs, they are saying that something is up, something needs to happen. And there's sort of a conversation now about what needs to happen. I think that this is the right conversation to be in. And it's going to take data, it's going to take research, it's going to take those examples of what works, what doesn't work to inform that conversation. So read up on those resources, learn about what can work, what doesn't work. We have resources that we made available at joincampaignzero.org. And the use of force project. And so, those are some things that can help you be informed as you walk into those meetings, as you make those calls. But ultimately, I think this is about putting the maximum pressure on your local officials to take action, and not any actions, but actions that can make the biggest difference right now.
All right, Attorney Working?
I'll say two main points. Number one, citizens could call the police a lot less. It's not just the Karens in Central Park who are abusing the power of that. There's plenty of times where people can't be adults when they do a custody exchange, and they're hollering at each other about new boyfriend or something, and they call the police, and police aren't there to intervene in every problem you have. One of the biggest problems in Memphis, and someone in the comment section just alluded to this, is people call the police so much, everything gets to be a statistic, which qualifies us for federal funding. And there's a lot of times you don't need to call the police. Last week, there's a homeless guy in my neighborhood where I work, and he takes people's trash cans to collect, soda cans for recycling money. Okay, he stole my trash can. I know he stole my trash can. He's the guy that steals everybody's trash can. I didn't call the police. I called the city and said, hey, I need a new trash can. But it doesn't get reported as a theft and a stat, and there's a lot of times where people, try to get the police involved in things that don't need to be involved in. Number two, not only not involving the police as much, get yourself involved. And one of the great ways I'll say as a defense attorney to do that is don't roll your eyes at the chance to serve on a jury and complain about it. We actually fought the Revolutionary War for the right to jury trials, believe it or not. Most people don't know this, but the founding fathers were defense attorneys. John Adams actually was the lawyer for the soldiers in the Boston Massacre that fired into a crowd. And to show you how long America has been deferential to police violence, they were acquitted, right? So, even when we were colonists, not Americans, we were dealing with the problem of excessive police violence. And the point to be a juror is really democracy at its most pure form. To come in, I can tell you my clients desperately need people who are willing to listen, who are willing to judge them fairly, who are going to come in with no agenda, and give them the opportunity to face policemen and say it didn't happen like that. And we need open-minded jurors who are willing to judge the police on their actions in the public forum, which is our job as Americans. You only get the chance to do it about every 10 years. I'll never get the chance to serve on a jury ever, because there's no prosecutor who's going to let me on a jury. But it's important that that is the actual mechanism in our country where we as citizens hold the police and the government accountable for the way that they treat our fellow citizens. And is it justified or is it not? So I would just say, more than anything, if you had the chance to serve on a jury and hold the police accountable and judge them on their actions, please do that and take it seriously.
All right, thank you very much. And we're going to move into the audience questions and answers. I actually have several here, and I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but I'll try to squeeze a couple in here in this last 5 minutes that we have. Question, first one's for Sam, is asking if you can explain the difference between 8 can't wait and 8 to abolition. Essentially, the difference between making police better versus making them versus a more abolitionist approach.
So, this is what I was talking about earlier, where there are 2 areas of work that need to happen simultaneously. One is that we are thinking about reimagining public safety and moving towards a vision whereby for all of these things that I talked about, we are not asking police or resourcing police to respond to a range of things that police have no business dealing with. And we are cutting the police budget and scaling up alternatives to deal with those situations commensurate with the scale of those calls. So that is a body of work that has to happen, right? It is a critical piece of the solution. And at the same time, we have to recognize that particularly in cities that have resisted any sort of change at all, even, much less far-reaching changes, that it's going to take some time to build towards that vision.
The question we're going to aim toward Councilman Smiley is, what is the status of the reforms that you're pushing for in Memphis City Council currently?
Well, right now, the MPD has adopted, I think, all but 2 of the 8 can't wait principles. There is no outright ban on chokeholds. I think right now the justification for allowing chokeholds will be in a situation where there was a threat to the officer's life. And then the other one, if I understand it correctly, there's no outright ban at shooting at moving vehicles. And the justification would be in, I guess, when an officer's safety was threatened. But real quickly, I do want to touch on two key things I think is important when we talk about in this conversation for police reform that we address. And one, right now, there is a referendum currently on the ballot to allow officers the opportunity to live up to 50 miles outside of the city. That will open the door to people policing in our communities who have no familiar relationship other than what they see on TV about our city. Right now, the referendum to take that off the ballot will be before City Council next week. But I urge everyone who lives within the city within the county to do, who cares about police reform, is to email every member of the City Council, including the mayor, suggesting that they vote to take the referendum of 50-mile radius off the ballot. And the second thing, Police Director Mike Rollins is retiring this year, and the City of Memphis is currently starting the process to bring in a new police director. What I would urge everyone to do is to send emails, calls, or even stand outside of City Hall and ask the City Council and the mayor to make sure that we have a community advisory board. So when we select a new police director, that police director will understand that he or she will be accountable to the people.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the audience, and thank you for those who returned after our little technical glitch there where we got kicked off. We did get a good number of folks back in there. Sam, did you want to end with a exclamation point?
Yeah, I mean, so, this is something that will take a whole lot of work moving forward. As I said earlier, it's so important for communities to be putting the maximum amount of pressure on at every level of government, but especially locally, on the city to take action. Even on some of these policies like chokeholds. I mean, there's no reason for those to be authorized. You know, things like shooting at moving vehicles. This is something that is banned in many cities across the country. You know, to my knowledge, and again, I would love to see the updated policy for Memphis, but when we looked at it, it didn't require de-escalation either, and a host of other things. So I'm hopeful that the policy and the standards can be raised. And as I said earlier, that is not everything that needs to happen, but it is an important first step. And then we got to enforce those standards, got to think about the accountability structure. You got to make sure that officers who violate those standards, officers who use chokeholds, officers who don't de-escalate, that those officers can be held accountable in a meaningful way, and that there's transparency about how that's happening, so the public can hold elected officials accountable to doing good on making good on those promises. And then thinking about reimagining public safety in general. How do we move towards that vision? How do we, you know, reject any expansion of the police budget or the number of officers and move in the opposite direction, so that we can get to a vision that can truly protect communities from harm, and especially from police violence.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. Thank you again to the audience. Thank you to our panel. Glad you could attend. Did post the rest of the day's agenda for this summit in the chat box. Hope to see you guys in one of the other sessions. Thank you guys for a great talk.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Pleasure, Sam. Pleasure.
You too. Thank you.
Oh, hi there. I'm Frankie Dakin, one of today's moderators. You might see me a few times throughout the day to offer a quick reminder about how to navigate through today's virtual